Sophia Martin stepped out of the car and took a deep breath, letting the cool autumn air fill her lungs. The house stood before her like something from a dream, or maybe a nightmare. It was an old colonial home, its paint peeling slightly, the windows large and dark, framed by thick oak trees that stretched their limbs toward the sky. The front porch sagged just a little, as if the house itself was tired of standing for over a century. But to Sophia, it had a charm she couldn't resist. She loved old things, things with history. And this house, it had plenty of that. Behind her, Ethan slammed the car trunk shut. "It's perfect, isn't it?" he said, coming up beside her with a grin. "Just like we imagined." Ethan was always the optimist. Even now, with the roof line slightly crooked and the faded shutters hanging loosely, he saw potential. Sophia admired that about him. But as she stared at the house, a cold knot formed in her stomach. She wanted to call it excitement. This was their fresh start after all. But something about the place unsettled her. "It's beautiful," she replied softly, forcing a smile. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. Their new home sat on the outskirts of Salem, Massachusetts, far enough from the busy streets to feel isolated but close enough that the town's famous history loomed over everything. It was mid-October, the perfect season for a new beginning, or so they thought. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of orange and red, but the trees here seemed to cast more shadow than light. As they walked up to the front door, Ethan fumbled with the keys. "Can you believe this? Our own house. I can already picture it. After a few renovations, this place will be incredible." Sophia nodded, but her gaze lingered on the windows. They were so dark, even with the sunlight filtering through the trees. For a moment, she thought she saw movement inside, just a flicker of something in the corner of her eye. But when she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, brushing off the thought. "Stress," she told herself. "It's just stress from the move." The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. Sophia had always been drawn to interior design, and she spent hours each day envisioning the possibilities for each room. She filled her mind with paint colors, furniture arrangements, and restoration ideas, trying to drown out the strange unease that seemed to grow every time she walked through the house alone. The nights were a different story. On the first night, after finally falling into bed, exhausted, Sophia found herself wide awake within hours. The house was silent, yet not. There was a faint creaking, a rustle in the walls, like old bones settling into place. She listened for a moment, holding her breath, but Ethan snored peacefully beside her, completely unaware. Just an old house, she thought. Old houses make noises. But the second night, the sounds became more distinct. Footsteps, faint but deliberate. They paced from one end of the upstairs hallway to the other, back and forth, back and forth. Sophia sat up, staring at the doorway. The floorboards creaked again, just outside their bedroom door. Her heart pounded in her chest. She nudged Ethan, but he only mumbled in his sleep and rolled over. Frustrated, she got up, tiptoeing to the door. The footsteps stopped. She stood there for a long moment, the doorknob cold in her hand, but she didn't open it. Instead, she backed away slowly, crawling back into bed and pulling the covers up to her chin. The house was just settling, she told herself. Old wood expanding, contracting, shifting. It had to be, but that didn't explain why she felt so watched. By the third night, the feeling of being observed had become almost unbearable. Lying in bed, Sophia stared at the ceiling, listening intently for the footsteps. They didn't come. This time the silence was louder, more oppressive. Every shadow in the room seemed to stretch toward her, flickering in the pale moonlight streaming through the window. Ethan was asleep again, his breathing steady, his face peaceful. She turned her head, eyes scanning the room, when something caught her attention. In the far corner, where the moonlight didn't quite reach, there was a shadow, darker than the rest. It wasn't like the normal soft patches of darkness that formed in a dim room. No, this shadow was dense, like it had weight, and it was watching her. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light, but the longer she stared, the more she could make out a shape. It wasn't just a shadow. It had a form, vaguely human, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too round. And the smile, God, the smile, stretched impossibly wide, glowing faintly in the darkness, as if its teeth were catching the sparse light in the room. Sophia froze, her body paralyzed with a primal fear she hadn't felt since childhood nightmares. She squeezed her eyes shut, telling herself that when she opened them again, it would be gone. It had to be. But when she opened them, the shadow was still there. Closer now. Watching. Smiling. The next morning, she tried to tell Ethan, "I saw something last night, in the room," she said over coffee, her voice trembling more than she intended. Ethan looked up from his laptop, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean, something? Like a mouse?" Sophia shook her head. "No, it was a figure, a shadow. It was just standing there in the corner, watching me." Ethan chuckled softly, setting his mug down. "Babe, you've been stressed out with the move, and this house, it's old. Probably just your mind playing tricks on you." Sophia wanted to argue, to tell him that what she saw was no trick. But how could she explain the unnatural stillness of it? The way its grin seemed to grow wider the longer she looked. She just sighed and nodded, letting him brush it off. That night, the shadow didn't appear, nor the next. Sophia began to relax, thinking maybe Ethan was right. Maybe she was just tired, her mind playing tricks on her. But the house still felt strange, as though it was holding its breath, waiting. A few days later, while unpacking some old boxes in the attic, Sophia came across a dusty journal tucked away in a forgotten corner. The leather was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, flipping through the entries. Most were mundane, records of the weather, daily tasks, but one page stood out, darker ink scrawled in a hurried hand. "He's always smiling. I can see him in the corners of every room. He's waiting." Sophia's blood ran cold as she stared at the words. They were written over and over, the letters getting more frantic as the page went on. Just as she turned to show Ethan, she heard it, the soft creak of footsteps on the stairs. Sophia sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edges of the journal she had found. Its pages felt like fragile skin beneath her fingertips, and she couldn't stop thinking about those words. "He's always smiling." The script was desperate, the ink dark and erratic, as if whoever wrote it had been on the edge of something terrible. The more she thought about it, the more the words seemed to echo in her mind, merging with the memory of that shadow, that impossibly wide grin. Across the table, Ethan was glued to his laptop, oblivious to the unease that was creeping deeper into her thoughts. He was working late again, crunching numbers for a client, and he barely glanced up when she pushed the journal toward him. "I found this in the attic," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the house. Ethan sighed and closed his laptop just long enough to pick up the book, flipping through a few pages with disinterest. "Looks old," he muttered before setting it aside. "Probably just some old tenant's diary. You know how people were back then? Superstitious about every creak and groan in these old houses." Sophia stared at him, the frustration bubbling up inside her. "It's not just superstition, Ethan. There's something wrong with this house. You don't feel it." He rubbed his eyes, exhaling loudly. "What I feel is exhaustion. You've been stressed with the move, with the renovations. It's all starting to get to you." His voice was calm, but his words carried an edge of dismissal that made her blood boil. "Maybe you just need to get out of the house for a bit. Clear your head." But Sophia didn't want to get out of the house. She wanted to understand it. The journal wasn't just the ramblings of a scared tenant. She was sure of it. Something was here. Something watching. Lurking. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized she needed answers. That night, Sophia found herself unable to sleep again. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that felt deliberate, as if everything was holding its breath. She stared at the ceiling, her mind buzzing. The figure hadn't appeared for several nights now, but that only made her more anxious. It was like waiting for the other shoe to drop. She wondered if it was watching her even now, hiding in some dark corner, waiting for the perfect moment to reappear. She slid out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Ethan, and padded down the stairs. The old house groaned beneath her feet, and she winced at every sound. In the dim light of the kitchen, she flipped through the journal again, searching for more clues. The words blurred as her tired eyes skimmed page after page of monotonous entries about the weather and mundane tasks. But as she neared the end of the book, the writing became more erratic, more unhinged. He's always smiling. I can't sleep anymore. I hear him. Even when I close my eyes, he watches me. The corners of the room aren't safe. They never were. God help me. He's coming closer. Sophia's hand trembled as she closed the journal. The sense of dread weighed heavily on her chest, a suffocating pressure she couldn't escape. She wasn't imagining this. Something was wrong. The figure she saw, the noises at night. It was all connected. And if the journal was any indication, whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop. It was getting bolder. The next day, Sophia found herself at the town library, determined to dig deeper into the history of the house. Salem had always had a dark reputation, haunted by its past, by the infamous witch trials, by the superstitions that clung to its streets like fog. But Sophia wasn't looking for witches or ghosts. She was looking for something more tangible, something real. The librarian, an older woman with thin, silver hair, looked up from her desk as Sophia approached. "Hey, can I help you, dear?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing, as if she had seen dozens of people like Sophia, people drawn to the darker corners of Salem's history. "I'm looking for information on a house," Sophia said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. She lowered her voice. "It's an old colonial on the outskirts of town, 22 Hillcrest Road." The librarian's expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. She didn't speak for a moment, her eyes scanning Sophia's face as if trying to decide whether to tell her something. Finally, she nodded slowly and motioned for Sophia to follow her into the archives. The basement was cold, the air thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Rows of metal shelves held newspapers, records, and photographs, neatly organized but long forgotten by most of the town. The librarian pulled out a drawer filled with yellowed papers and began rifling through them. "The Fisher House," she said quietly, not looking up as she searched. "That's what most people around here still call it, though it's had a dozen owners since." "Fisher?" Sophia asked, the name striking a chord in her memory. "Nathaniel Fisher," the librarian said, finally finding the folder she was looking for. She handed it to Sophia. "He built the house in the late 1800s. Lived there alone after his wife and daughter died, under strange circumstances." Sophia opened the folder, her eyes scanning the black and white photographs of the house, then in pristine condition, and the yellowed articles detailing Nathaniel's life. He had been a carpenter, well respected in the community, but after his family died, he became a recluse. There were rumors about him, whispers of strange rituals and secret gatherings in the house. And then, one day, Nathaniel simply vanished. No one ever saw him again. The house had changed hands several times since, and most of the owners never stayed long. They left quietly, always giving vague reasons for their departure. But one article stood out, a headline from 1923, "Fisher Family Curse." It was a small, speculative piece in a local paper, written after another family had abruptly left the home. The author described eerie occurrences, shadows in the night, strange noises, and a constant, unsettling feeling of being watched. A quote from the mother of the family caught Sophia's eye. "We saw him in the corners of the room, always smiling." Her heart raced as she read the words. It was the same thing she had seen, the same smile. The figure was more than just a figment of her imagination. It had been haunting this house for decades, maybe longer. Sophia thanked the librarian and left with the folder tucked under her arm, her mind racing with more questions than answers. Who, or what, was this smiling figure? And why was it tied to the house? She needed to know more, but part of her was terrified of what she might find. When she got home, the house felt different. The air was heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on her. Ethan was out for the day, and the silence in the house was deafening. She walked through the rooms, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every corner of the house seemed darker than before, every shadow longer. She went to the attic again, hoping to find more answers. As she rummaged through old boxes, she came across something odd, an old photograph of a man, his face partially obscured by shadow, but his smile unmistakable. It was the same smile, the same grin that had haunted her nights. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the picture. This was Nathaniel Fisher. He had never left the house. At least, not completely. Suddenly, a creak from behind her. She spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The attic was empty, but the shadows seemed to move, twisting and shifting as if alive. Sophia backed toward the stairs, her skin crawling. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her from the darkness. As she descended the stairs, the house seemed to groan and whisper around her. She heard it again, faint laughter, like the sound of someone mocking her from afar. It echoed down the hall, growing louder with each step she took. By the time she reached the living room, the laughter had stopped, but the oppressive weight of the house remained. She stood in the middle of the room, her breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was she losing her mind? Or was the house trying to tell her something? Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud crash from the kitchen. Sophia ran toward the sound, her pulse racing. When she reached the doorway, she froze. The kitchen cabinets were wide open, their contents spilled onto the floor. But that wasn't what terrified her. In the reflection of the window, she saw it, the figure standing just behind her. Its smile was wider than ever, its eyes gleaming with malice. Sophia spun around, but the room was empty. Sophia stood frozen in the kitchen, her breath shallow, heart pounding in her chest. The reflection in the window lingered in her mind, the figure standing just behind her, grinning with a malice that chilled her to the bone. But when she spun around, the room was empty. Nothing but the scattered contents of the cabinets, the eerie silence of the house pressing in on her from all sides. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she backed out of the kitchen, her eyes darting to every corner, every shadow. She was sure it had been there. She'd seen it, clear as day. The smiling figure was no longer just a presence in the dark of night. It had crossed a line. It was here now, in her waking hours, in her home. Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched the back of a chair, trying to steady herself. She couldn't live like this. The fear was suffocating, wrapping itself around her like a cold, damp shroud. She needed to get out, get away from this house, from the thing that was watching her. But she couldn't leave, not without understanding what it wanted, why it was tormenting her. In a rush of desperation, Sophia grabbed the journal from the kitchen counter and ran upstairs to the attic. She fumbled with the latch, throwing the old wooden door open and climbing the stairs two at a time. The air up here was thick, heavy, as if the attic itself was steeped in some kind of ancient, unspoken dread. Dust swirled around her as she flipped through the pages of the journal, her fingers trembling. There had to be something she'd missed, something to explain how Nathaniel Fisher's presence still haunted this house, how the shadow of his smile could linger after all these years. But every entry was the same, each more frantic and fearful than the last. He's watching. He's always watching. I see him everywhere. Sophia's hands gripped the pages tighter, her mind racing. Nathaniel had disappeared from the house over a century ago, but his ghost, no, something worse, was still here, feeding on fear, growing stronger with each passing day. And now, it wasn't just watching her anymore. It was coming for her. She stumbled across an entry near the back of the journal, the handwriting nearly illegible, as if written in a fit of madness. He smiled at me today. I think this is it. I think I'm next. I can't escape him. He's in the walls, in the air, in every corner of this house. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as her eyes scanned the page. She knew the feeling, knew exactly what this terrified person had meant. The house itself felt alive, every creak and groan like the breathing of some ancient, malevolent force. It had wrapped itself around her, drawn her in, and now it wasn't letting go. Her eyes flicked to the photograph she had found earlier, the one of Nathaniel Fisher, his face shadowed, but his grin unmistakable. She held it up to the dim light streaming through the small attic window, studying his expression. That same twisted smile. It was as if the house had absorbed him, as if his presence had seeped into the very walls, becoming something far worse than a ghost. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the house, jolting Sophia from her thoughts. It came from downstairs, the sound reverberating through the old wood, sending a chill down her spine. It wasn't the usual groaning of the house settling. It was deliberate, like something had been thrown, or like something, or someone, was moving. She grabbed the photograph, slipping it into her pocket, and hurried back down the stairs, her heart pounding. She could feel it now, that oppressive presence growing stronger with each step she took. The house felt smaller, the walls closing in around her, and as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. The door to the previously locked room at the end of the hallway was wide open. It hadn't been opened before. She and Ethan had tried to open it on their first night here, only to find it sealed shut, as if the house itself had refused to let them in. But now, the door stood ajar, dark shadows spilling out into the hallway like thick, inky tendrils. Sophia's throat tightened, her legs suddenly feeling like lead. Everything in her screamed to turn around, to run, but she couldn't. Something was pulling her toward that room, some force she couldn't resist. It was as if the house had finally decided to show her what it had been hiding all along. She moved toward the door slowly, her feet barely lifting off the floor as she approached. The air was different here, colder, heavier. As she crossed the threshold, a deep sense of dread settled in her bones. The room beyond was dark, its corners thick with shadow, and the faint scent of decay hung in the air, as if something had died long ago and never been found. Her hand fumbled for the light switch on the wall, but when she flipped it, nothing happened. The room remained pitch black, the only light coming from the dim hallway behind her. But she could feel it. There was something here, something watching her. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she stepped inside, her breath catching in her throat. The room felt impossibly large, the shadows stretching far beyond the walls. She took another step, her fingers brushing against the cool, damp wallpaper, and then she saw it. In the far corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, much taller than any human, and its limbs were twisted at unnatural angles. Its head was tilted downward, the wide, gleaming smile stretching across its face, even in the dark. Sophia's body went rigid, her throat tightening as terror flooded through her. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, grinning at her, its eyes glinting with a sick, cold light. And then, as if sensing her fear, it began to shift, its body contorting, slowly inching toward her. Sophia stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure's grin widened, impossibly large, its jagged teeth gleaming in the darkness. It was coming for her, and she knew deep in her bones that it wasn't going to stop. She turned and bolted for the door, her legs trembling as she raced back down the hallway. She could feel it behind her, hear the soft creak of its footsteps as it followed, slow but deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps as she reached the stairs, nearly tripping over the first step in her desperation to escape. The air grew colder as she descended, the oppressive weight of the house bearing down on her. She needed to find Ethan. They needed to leave this house now. But as she reached the ground floor, she froze. Ethan was standing in the living room, his back to her, staring out the window. The air around him seemed thick, as if the shadows themselves were wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the darkness. He didn't move, didn't turn when she called his name. He just stood there, completely still, as if entranced by something outside. Sophia approached him cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "Ethan," she whispered, reaching out to touch his shoulder. "Ethan, we need to go." But when he turned to face her, his eyes were vacant, glazed over with a strange, unnatural light. And that smile, the same smile she had seen in the shadow, in the photograph, was now spread across his face, wide and eerie, as if he wasn't himself anymore. A cold wave of horror washed over Sophia as she backed away from him, her mind racing. This wasn't Ethan. It couldn't be. Something had taken him. The house. It had gotten to him first. Her vision blurred with tears as she stumbled toward the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. She had to get out. She had to get help. But just as her fingers closed around the doorknob, the air in the room shifted. Behind her, Ethan's voice, soft but wrong, whispered, "He's always smiling, Sophia. Don't you see? He's always been here, waiting for you." Sophia's breath hitched as she turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. Ethan's face was twisted in that horrible grin, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight into her soul. And then, from the corner of the room, she saw it, the figure, stepping out of the shadows, its smile stretching wider, Its eyes locked on hers. She was trapped. Her body trembled as the figure came closer, its form looming larger with every step. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the stench of decay. Sophia's mind screamed for her to run, to fight, but her body wouldn't move. She was frozen, paralyzed by the figure's gaze, its smile curling into something monstrous. And then, just as the figure was inches away, everything went dark. The house was silent.